The recovered pick feeds and forensic excavations that inform this account were not found in a single repository. Rather, they surfaced across multiple vectors, corrupted data cores exhumed from the rebel Forge world Zana II during the Great Scouring, fragmented transmission logs recorded by the 5th Legion's initial survey squadrons, and eyewitness testimony from surviving support personnel and Mechanicum technicians later debriefed by the Adeptus Administratum. These sources present a consistent strategic outline even where details diverge, and they provide the earliest reliable impressions of a sequence of operations that would later be known collectively as the Battle of Advex-mors. The operation opened as a conventional projection of force but was informed by urgent intelligence. Reconnaissance runs by the 5th Legion mapped a system of 6 worlds heavily fortified and garrisoned, a concentration of defences whose scale briefly misled Imperial planners into believing they had discovered the enemy's primary seat of power rather than a forward outpost. This assessment shaped the initial strategic calculus and the composition of a fleet and landing force assembled expressly to overwhelm a densely entrenched foe. Imperial Command organised a force of considerable magnitude to the task. The core of the assault comprised approximately 50,000 warriors of the First Legion, supplemented by roughly 100,000 support troops contributed by local Mechanicum Tagmata and Imperial Army regiments. The fleet assigned to the operation numbered near 100 Capital-class starships, augmented by many times that number in escort and support craft. The formation's leading wedge included 3 Gloriana-class battleships, each a centre of gravity in both firepower and symbolic importance to the First Legion's command hierarchy. The immediate objectives were explicit and mutually reinforcing. Command ordered a twofold operation: neutralize the war moon in orbit that served as the system's principal defensive fulcrum, and effect a rapid planetary landing to seize the world's capital and command centres before the enemy could regroup. The planners judged that a prolonged orbital bombardment to destroy the orbiting weapon would invite unacceptable casualties and surrender the initiative, so they elected a simultaneous assault in which elements of the Legion would infiltrate and disable the war moon, while the bulk of the Legion effected a decisive ground assault. Translation of that force into the Advex-mors system was marked by a violent and focused opening. The Imperial fleet translated into local space as a single wedge of coordinated formations. Initial opposition consisted of scattered squadrons of Rangdan warp barks and lighter attack craft. They were quickly overwhelmed by the Legion's Astartes concentrated gun line, though the Rangda employed directed energy systems whose signatures later earned the chronicler's epithet Shadow Blasters. These weapons produced radiation effects that led to widespread sickness among Void crews and complicated salvage and boarding operations in the immediate aftermath. Ground operations opened on the system's peripheral worlds and proceeded with measured professional brutality. The First Legion committed detachments to 4 outer planets where garrisons of neural-collared slave soldiers and a small complement of Rangdan overseers stood between the invasion force and the system's interior. These engagements were tactically decisive for the attackers and functioned as both a physical clearing of approach corridors and an intelligence-gathering series of probes into Rangdan tactics, armament and battlefield doctrine. The slave infantry employed by the Rangda died in vast numbers in service to their masters. Their role as expendable buffers shaped Imperial operational tempo and the ethical calculations of later archivists. Parallel naval actions concentrated on the war moon in orbit over Advex-mors Primus. Contemporary reports emphasize the structure's scale and lethality, an engine of war whose batteries could rival an entire fleet and whose armour resisted conventional capital-class strikes. The Rangdan defensive disposition was not one of disorganised reaction, but of coordinated suppression. Their void craft assembled in a defensive constellation around the war moon, denying the Imperium a clear approach for sustained orbital assault and forcing an alternative plan of action. What followed in orbit became the defining narrative moment of the engagement. The battleship Paradigm of Hate, already wounded by Rangdan Stalker drones and by the war moon's exotic energy projectors, executed a high-order sacrificial maneuver. The vessel, its void shields at critical levels and its crew and Astartes contingents fighting to hold boarding points, collided with the war moon's hull in a kinetic strike that breached the outer armour and allowed insurgent teams and boarding parties to press a close action within the moon's exterior works. Those aboard the Paradigm of Hate then set its reactors to catastrophic failure, converting the battleship into a terrestrial-level demolition charge against the enemy installation. The subsequent explosion crippled the war moon and dispersed a lethal cloud of debris throughout high orbit, giving the remainder of the Imperial fleet an opening to press toward low orbit and begin planetary deployment. The immediate cost of that decision was severe. Boarding contingents and remaining crew on the Paradigm of Hate perished in the reactor detonation, and the loss of the ship itself removed an asset the fleet could not easily replace. The tactical effect, however, was to deny the Rangda their orbital superiority and force their ships into a chaotic melee where Imperial naval doctrine's emphasis on disciplined gunnery and concentrated macro-cannon strikes regained leverage. The remaining Gloriana-class battleships, among them the Invincible Reason and Truth's Razor, used the window to drive into low orbit and clear lanes for planetary insertion. Planetfall was executed as a dispersed but coordinated series of drop operations. Drop pods fell in multiple waves onto wastelands away from the equatorial chain of fortifications, while smaller ground and air elements spread into forward axes of advance aboard gunships and Stormbird-class transports. Initial raiding columns were tasked to strike fortifications and to engage approaching slave columns, thereby fixing enemy formations and buying time for the main bodies of the Legion to marshal into coherent assault formations. Those raiding forces reported early contact with Rangdan elite units, an encounter that revealed significant qualitative differences between the Rangda and their coerced conscripts. Eyewitness accounts from the surviving marshals of the hosts of wind and fire and from the Order of Crows described the Rangdan elite as towering, lithe warriors, adorned with energy-shielding arrays and wielding weapons of crystalline construction that discharged neurotoxins or induced localized field disruptions. Those first-hand impressions emphasized not only physical prowess, but an unfamiliar tactical fluidity. The Rangda did not fight as slavish automatons, but as a species accustomed to integrating technology and physiology in combat roles. The intelligence returned from these early engagements proved operationally valuable, revealing that the Rangda commonly employed neural collars to constrain human and other captives into obedient formations, and that they were prepared to expend those cohorts in great numbers to probe and attrit superior forces. These probing actions informed Grandmaster Urian Vendraig's decision-making in the critical days that followed. Having lost precious hours and faced with the potential of a prolonged siege, if the fortresses of the equatorial chain were left intact, Command reconstituted a plan to achieve decisive engagement on the planet's surface. The First Legion massed a mobile reserve and concentrated its most experienced hosts to exploit weaknesses identified by the raiding parties. The doctrine of the First Legion in this phase emphasized combined arms mobility, the integration of swift jet bike elements, and land speeders in a reconnaissance and harassment role, with heavy tanks and the host of blades holding the principal battle line. When the two principal field armies met across a broad 100-kilometer expanse of broken outlands, the dynamics of the engagement began with attrition against the Rangdan's slave columns and then escalated into a direct confrontation between the First Legion and the Rangdan elite. The Rangda accepted heavy casualties among their slaves as a deliberate tactic, using those masses to fix and probe Imperial lines while their elite warriors awaited an opportunity to strike. The Legion countered by committing veteran formations in a controlled hammer and anvil maneuver, preserving a mobile counterforce to exploit any overextension. The decisive moment occurred when Grandmaster Vendraig, leading from the front in accordance with First Legion doctrine of exemplary command presence, directed an offensive that pierced the slave battalions and engaged the Rangdan corps. Contemporary accounts converge on the image of a pitched melee in which both sides suffered severe losses. The technological shielding and crystalline weaponry of the Rangda caused grievous wounds among Terran formations, while Legion Terminators and their tyrannic greatswords inflicted commensurate damage on the Xenos elite. The duel between Vendraig and the Rangdan warmaster is reported in multiple surviving sources as the tactical fulcrum of the confrontation. The death of the Rangdan leader precipitated a breakdown in enemy cohesion and allowed Imperial forces to convert local advantage into strategic momentum. Following the collapse of organised resistance in open terrain, the conflict transitioned to a campaign of sieges against the fortresses that remained under Rangdan control. Imperial forces, now backed by consolidated orbital superiority and specialised breacher and destroyer cadres, methodically reduced each stronghold. The operations combined heavy bombardment, storming actions, and targeted forays into subterranean warrens exposed by the orbital debris storm. Surviving Rangda were either slain in close-quarters combat or trapped and killed within the engineered labyrinths of their war moon and fortresses. Casualty accounting from the campaign shows notable variance among sources. The recovered Xana II data cores and some Imperial after-action reports record the overall cost to the First Legion as being on the order of 10,000 warriors lost and the destruction of approximately 50 ships of the line, figures that underscore the scale and ferocity of the fighting. Other contemporaneous records, summarized in Imperial archive synopses, record a more conservative figure for immediate battlefield losses at Advex-mors, approximately 5,000 battle brothers lost over 4 months of combat, suggesting either differing temporal scopes, typographical inconsistencies in surviving logs, or deliberate redaction and reclassification by various authorities. The disparity in the numerical record has informed subsequent historiography and cautions against acceptance of a single definitive casualty figure without cross-referencing multiple data sets. The operational outcomes of the opening campaign were unambiguous in strategic terms. The First Legion secured control of the Advex-mors system, destroyed the functional capacity of the Rangdan war moon, and reduced the planetary fortresses to ruins. Nevertheless, the broader implications extended beyond the immediate theatre. The engagement at Advex-mors revealed the Rangda to be capable of large-scale projection of force and of fielding technology that could, if left unopposed, threaten Imperial holdings across adjacent systems. The Imperium's success in the system therefore represented both a tactical victory and an admission that the Rangdan threat would require prolonged containment and further campaigns at strategic depth. The recovered research material emphasizes two further considerations that informed later Imperial policy. First, the material culture and munitions recovered from the Rangdan fortifications suggested manufacturing processes and engineering approaches not entirely comprehensible to contemporary mechanicum analysts, a factor that complicated exploitation and forced a cautious approach to reverse engineering. Second, the presence of enslaved human and non-human populations wearing neural control devices highlighted the Rangda's willingness to weaponize sentient labor at industrial scale, a practice that the Imperium would later categorize as a primary justification for sustained exterminatory operations against that species. This account concludes its opening segment with the operational facts and initial assessments that define the earliest phase of the First Rangdan conflict as recorded in available material. The preceding parts will expand upon the organizational composition, logistical ramifications, and the Inquisition's later observations. However, the documentary core underlying those later analyses originates in the field records, salvage manifests, and pict feeds referenced above and in the data cores recovered from Xana II that first made a coherent reconstruction possible, the Battle of Advex-mors. The compiled field records and encoded transmissions recovered from the campaign data of Advex-mors permit a structured review of the major factions that participated in the engagement. Cross-analysis between Mechanicum transmission logs, Administratum fleet manifests, and residual astropathic echoes recorded by Ordo Historicus chroniclers reveals an operational theatre defined by the intersection of three dominant powers. The first and foremost was the First Legion, known to later ages as the Dark Angels, under the command of Grandmaster Urian Vendraig. The second consisted of the Mechanicum Tajamata and attendant auxilia, drawn from nearby forge holdings, notably Xana II. The third was the Xenos polity identified in Imperial records as the Rangda, a hostile civilization exhibiting extensive command of neural warfare, energy field manipulation, and biotechnological weapon design. The First Legion fielded multiple orders and hosts, each organised according to tyrannic martial principles inherited from the Unification Wars. Among these, the host of iron supplied the heavy armour columns, while the hosts of wind and fire constituted rapid response strike elements. The Order of Crows, the host of blades, and the veteran contingents of the hosts of bone and crowns formed the primary ground assault components. Each host displayed a structured hierarchy of marshals and sergeants, all acting under direct command from the Grandmaster's Council aboard the Gloriana-class flagship Invincible Reason. The Legion's operational doctrine emphasized measured aggression, calculated use of reserves, and the strategic principle that precision of violence outweighed its volume. These tenets would define the Legion's conduct throughout the Battle of Advex-mors. Accompanying the First Legion were extensive Mechanicum forces organised under the Tagmata Zana. The Tagmata contributed both technical assets and independent combat maniples, including Thanatar siege engines, Myrmidon destructors, and Skittery ranger cohorts. The Mechanicum presence ensured constant fleet repair capability and facilitated data recovery from Rangdan technology, though later Inquisition audits would note the high incidence of loss among Mechanicum teams tasked with analysing Xenos devices. Administratum sources estimate the Tagmata's combat personnel at approximately 15,000, not counting servitor contingents. Their role was not purely auxiliary. The Tagmata engaged directly in planetary assaults, particularly in breaching fortifications whose materials resisted standard Astartes demolitions. Supporting the main invasion were Imperial army regiments drawn from frontier worlds under the Segmentum Solar's command. These included mechanized infantry and atmospheric assault divisions, whose task was to secure flanking positions and maintain supply corridors once the Astartes established the beachheads. Their casualties were severe, particularly during the initial orbital landings when Rangdan surface batteries targeted their descent trajectories. Surviving records from regimental Vox transmissions reveal that human units often served as logistical anchors rather than frontline combatants once the Rangdan elites appeared. By contrast, the Astartes fought in concentrated spearheads, designed to absorb and return the Xenos' heaviest resistance. Opposing these assembled Imperial forces was a civilization that contemporary records could only describe in fragments. The Rangda were characterized by grotesque sophistication in both biological and technological disciplines. Descriptions provided by picked captures and recovered auger data indicate tall, digitigrade forms ranging between 3 and 4 meters in height. Their physiques lean yet heavily muscled. Their epidermis exhibited refractive sheens produced by microscopic energy field membranes. The Rangda's cranial structure displayed elongated mandibles and ocular cavities, fitted with adaptive lenses capable of operating across broad electromagnetic spectra. They communicated through harmonic frequencies beyond human auditory range, though battlefield witnesses recorded a resonant undertone that induced nausea and disorientation among unshielded personnel. Captured fragments of their technology revealed neural collars used to enslave human and alien populations. Each collar incorporated an organic lattice that interfaced directly with the subject's spinal column and cerebral cortex, establishing total obedience through a mixture of pain, stimulus, and neural overwriting. These enslaved formations, designated by administratum clerks as thrall legions, constituted the majority of the Rangda's visible fighting force. Genetic sampling of recovered corpses suggested multiple species origins, implying that the Rangda's dominion extended across vast regions of space and that their armies represented a composite of conquered peoples. Their control of these forces reflected a chillingly efficient exploitation of life as a strategic resource. The first recorded encounters between the First Legion and the Rangda took place in the frozen labyrinths beneath Advex-mors Extremis. Initial combat reports described the Legion's 8th chapter descending through fissures in the ice crust to neutralize a small refinery guarded by slave soldiers and a single Rangdan overseer. The Rangdan's initial reaction was one of controlled deployment rather than panic. It directed its thralls with flawless coordination, using neural impulses that reached through the ice caverns faster than Vox commands could propagate. Despite being outnumbered 10-1, the Astartes maintained formation integrity and executed systematic eliminations, advancing meter by meter through constricted tunnels whose reflective walls amplified the flash of bolter fire. The engagement lasted 3 hours by chronometric record, ending when Grandmaster Vendraig personally slew the Rangdan overseer. The speed and precision of that victory established an early psychological advantage for the Imperium and confirmed the viability of direct assault tactics against Rangdan-controlled slave populations. However, the pattern of subsequent encounters quickly escalated in complexity. Each of the 4 outer worlds presented stronger garrisons and more intricate layers of defense. Orbital reconnaissance showed dense networks of fortifications surrounded by slave labor camps, each guarded by a small cadre of true Rangda. Every time the Legion advanced, the Rangda released waves of thralls in what analysts later defined as attrition masking, sacrificing expendable units to test enemy strength and deplete ammunition stocks before committing elite elements. The psychological dimension of this tactic was severe. Imperial Vox recordings detail repeated calls for medici support among human auxilia, exposed to the spectacle of their own species used as cannon fodder. Yet the Astartes maintained discipline, recording minimal deviation from their operational objectives. The first confirmed hostile encounter between the First Legion and a full complement of Rangdan elites occurred during the Battle for the Orbital War Moon. The surviving crew of the Paradigm of Hate transmitted fragmented visual data moments before detonation. Those fragments showed humanoid figures encased in layered energy fields that shimmered with distortive radiation. The entities wielded elongated crystalline blades, emitting coherent plasma edges, and exhaled vapors later identified as concentrated neurotoxin. Legion sensor telemetry recorded temperature spikes and electromagnetic disturbances, consistent with exotic power sources integrated into the Rangdan physiology. No survivors from the boarding action remained to offer direct testimony, but the telemetry provided measurable confirmation of the Rangdan's advanced energy manipulation and biological integration. Following the destruction of the War Moon, the conflict shifted irreversibly to ground warfare on Advex-mors Primus. The first massed confrontation took place when the hosts of Wind and Fire made contact with mobile Rangdan hunter groups in the wastelands. The battle developed across arid plains scored by impact craters from orbital bombardment. The Rangda's elite fighters used refractive camouflage that rendered them partially invisible to standard Auspex detection. Observers reported flickering distortions like silhouettes seen through heat haze, appearing and vanishing among dust storms before striking at close range. The Legion's Astartes adapted quickly, deploying sensor drones and using pattern fire to disrupt the concealed movement. After multiple skirmishes, the Rangda adapted again, retreating into fortifications to lure pursuing forces into kill zones pre-sighted with energy projectors. The heaviest hostile engagement recorded during the planetary phase was the confrontation later designated as the Battle of the Outlands. Here, nearly 30,000 Astartes faced a combination of hundreds of thousands of thralls and several thousand Rangda elites. The terrain was uneven, composed of basalt ridges and impact furrows that favoured ambush tactics. The Rangda opened the engagement by sending their slave legions in dense columns, driving them forward through neural compulsion, even as orbital sensors registered mass psychogenic distress among the thralls. The Legion responded by coordinating heavy armour and jetbike squadrons to slice through the advancing lines, concentrating fire where the slave formations were densest. The ensuing combat produced vast casualties among the enslaved populations, but provided critical data on Rangdan command hierarchies, as Vox interception indicated that the true Rangda directed entire divisions through direct neural transmissions. Grandmaster Vendraig's tactical foresight in maintaining a mobile reserve became decisive as the Rangda elites advanced. Once they committed their primary strength, he counterattacked through the breach his forward elements had opened, driving directly into the Rangdan command cluster. The confrontation devolved into close-quarters combat in which Legion greatswords clashed against crystalline blades. Several reports emphasized the discharge of radiation and toxic vapors that accompanied each strike, forcing Astartes Medici to operate in full environmental containment. The duel between Vendraig and the Rangdan Warmaster formed the culmination of this sequence. Data extracted from his armor's life sign records confirms exposure to multiple neurotoxin agents before the Xenos leader was slain. The death of the Warmaster corresponded with measurable collapse in Rangdan battlefield coordination, confirming that their command structure was centralized and biologically linked to its leaders. In the days that followed, the remaining Rangda retreated into their equatorial fortresses. The First Legion initiated siege operations supported by Mechanicum artillery constructs. Rangdan resistance continued through automated defense drones and residual neural control fields that reanimated fallen thralls as improvised shock troops. The eventual breach of the final fortress marked the end of sustained hostilities within the system. Administratum post-action analysis determined that of the estimated 600,000 enemy combatants, the vast majority perished, with less than 2% unaccounted for in the aftermath. Those unaccounted remnants vanished during the orbital purges and have never been reliably traced in later records. From the standpoint of factional composition and combat chronology, the Battle of Advex-mors stands as a textbook demonstration of Imperial combined arms doctrine meeting a Xenos adversary of symmetrical sophistication. It also represents the first fully documented instance of an Imperium-scale force confronting an enemy whose mastery of neural and biotechnological warfare exceeded humanity's understanding. These encounters forced the Mechanicum to revise its threat classification schema, assigning the Rangda an omniscient threat index equivalent to a category exterminatus target. The first encounters and hostile engagements at Advex-mors therefore functioned not only as the prelude to later xenocides, but as the empirical foundation upon which all subsequent Rangdan threat assessments would depend. The closing phase of the Battle of Advex-mors was not marked by sudden triumph, but by a systematic process of elimination. Once the equatorial fortress line had been surrounded, the First Legion adopted an operational pattern characterized by calculated destruction rather than hasty assault. Each fortress was subjected to a sequence of orbital precision bombardments, followed by siege engines and massed infantry pushes designed to breach outer defensive layers without sacrificing the cohesion of the assault force. The Grandmaster's Council, still directed by Urian Vendraig despite injuries sustained during his duel with the Rangdan Warmaster, ordered that no structure remain intact once cleared. The instruction was clear: every trace of Rangdan presence was to be excised from the planet's surface and substructure. Orbital imagery preserved in Mechanicum data cores shows the transformation of Advex-mors Primus over the course of approximately 3 months. The surface that had once supported sprawling fortress cities and biomechanical manufactories became a barren field of vitrified stone and fused alloys. Even from orbit, the residual heat from bombardment produced an afterglow visible across the system. Breacher teams recorded internal fortification designs that differed from any human architectural logic. Corridors were irregular, curved and reinforced with composite alloys that emitted low-frequency resonance when struck, implying that the material itself was partially reactive or self-repairing. When these fortresses were finally breached, their interiors were discovered filled with the remnants of thousands of neural thralls and limited numbers of surviving Rangda who fought until total physical disintegration. The final siege action was carried out by the combined hosts of iron and bone, supported by Mechanicum Thanatar platforms whose plasma mortars could liquefy the layered energy barriers protecting the last fortress. As recorded by tactical auspex, the structure collapsed inward after its reactor cores were pierced by focused macro-laser bombardment from orbit. Subsequent atmospheric readings indicated the release of high concentrations of neurotoxic vapor, consistent with the biochemical agents previously observed in Rangdan weaponry. Adeptus Medicae detachments treated several hundred Astartes for exposure, though survival rates remained high due to the protective properties of their armor and autosanguine systems. In the aftermath, planetary surveys confirmed that no organized resistance persisted anywhere within the system. Scattered signals thought to originate from fleeing Rangda vessels were intercepted in the outer periphery, but the pursuing squadrons of the Imperial fleet failed to make contact. It was concluded that the surviving Rangda elements either self-destructed or escaped through unknown transit mechanisms, possibly involving warp-folding technology distinct from standard Imperial patterns. No further trace of them would be detected in the system after this date. The immediate result of the campaign was the re-establishment of Imperial dominance across a strategic corridor of space previously identified as a potential incursion route toward the Segmentum Solar. Imperial cartographers updated navigation charts to reflect the new boundary, classifying the entire Advex-mors system as quarantined and prohibiting civilian traffic, pending further evaluation by the Ordo Xenos. Mechanicum reclamation teams commenced operations to recover salvageable materials from both the Warmoon's debris field and the surface ruins, although their efforts were severely limited by residual radiation and unstable field emissions. Many of these teams were later recalled after the loss of several dozen personnel to unexplained disintegration phenomena traced to lingering exotic energy signatures within Rangdan alloys. Administratum summaries filed under Millennia 31, year 840, identify the Battle of Advex-mors as both a victory and a cautionary event. The First Legion achieved every immediate objective assigned to it: the destruction of the Warmoon, the eradication of Rangdan forces within the system, and the restoration of Imperial authority. Yet the cost in lives and material was considerable. Casualty figures for the Legion vary across reports, but consistently place losses between 5 and 10,000 Astartes. 50 ships of the line were rendered inoperative or destroyed outright, among them the irreplaceable Gloriana-class battleship Paradigm of Hate. When combined with the attrition of Mechanicum and Imperial army units, total losses may have exceeded 100,000 personnel. The surviving documents conclude that the scale of sacrifice would have been deemed catastrophic under ordinary circumstances, but in this instance it was accepted as the necessary price for eradicating a threat of unknown magnitude. The psychological and doctrinal impact of the campaign upon the First Legion cannot be understated. Post-campaign debriefs indicate that Vendraig emphasized the restoration of the Legion's repute following the political turbulence that had surrounded it in earlier Crusade operations. Advex-mors offered that opportunity. The victory, though costly, became a reaffirmation of the Legion's discipline and willingness to confront the most formidable enemies of mankind without hesitation. It is likely that the brutality displayed in the final sieges, the deliberate obliteration of all enemy structures, was not only a tactical decision, but a symbolic gesture intended to demonstrate the Legion's renewed resolve to Imperial authorities. For the wider Imperium, the aftermath of Advex-mors was more ambiguous. Although the campaign ended in a clear tactical success, the data recovered from the field raised troubling implications regarding the nature and scope of the Rangda civilization. Mechanicum analysts examining the remains of Rangdan devices identified materials and construction techniques inconsistent with any known technological lineage. The crystalline components used in their weaponry exhibited properties of self-tuning resonance, adjusting to the ambient electromagnetic environment in real time. Attempts to replicate or safely disassemble these artifacts resulted in multiple containment failures, leading to an immediate decree from the Fabricator General prohibiting further experimentation without direct authorization. This decree would later be cited as one of the earliest examples of Imperial policy toward technological quarantine in Xenos research. Additional findings emerged from the analysis of captured neural control devices. These instruments demonstrated a disturbing level of precision in manipulating sentient nervous systems. Bioalgorithmic readings suggested that the collars not only enforced obedience but were capable of erasing memory, personality, and emotion entirely, converting living organisms into functional extensions of Rangdan will. Mechanicum logicians concluded that the technology could, in theory, be adapted for large-scale population control. The Inquisition's later involvement ensured that all recovered samples were destroyed, and references to their composition were redacted from most archives. Eyewitness accounts collected from surviving ground personnel describe conditions within the captured fortresses that suggested industrial-level production of neural thralls. rows of containment vats and dissection tables were found filled with partial remains of both human and alien specimens. The air in these facilities was recorded as dense, with the stench of decaying organic material and ozone discharge, the result of automated systems continuing to function long after their masters were dead. Investigative servitors retrieved data fragments indicating that the Rangda extracted bioelectric potential from living hosts, transforming it into power sources for their machinery. Such findings contributed to the Imperium's decision to classify the species under the category of exterminatus-level threat, warranting total annihilation rather than conditional containment. During the closing weeks of the campaign, Urian Vendraig transmitted a final report to the Warmaster's office, summarizing the state of the system. The report's language, though formal, conveys an undercurrent of exhaustion. He described a world devoid of sound except for the constant hiss of residual plasma fires, a wasteland where the only movement came from servitors cataloguing debris. He noted that while victory had been achieved, it offered no sense of closure. The Rangda's destruction at Advex-mors, he wrote, felt incomplete, as though the enemy had only sacrificed a fragment of itself to test the Imperium's capacity for endurance. This sentiment would later prove prescient, for the battles that followed, the subsequent Rangdan Xenocides, suggested that the species had indeed been probing the limits of humanity's resistance. When the campaign officially concluded, the First Legion withdrew from Advex-mors, leaving behind a detachment of Mechanicum custodians to oversee decontamination and data recovery. The fleet reassembled in deep orbit, conducted a series of purification bombardments to eliminate lingering biological contaminants, and then departed for rearmament. Records indicate that the Imperial fleet maintained a quarantine cordon around the system for several decades. Ships approaching without authorization were destroyed by automated defense satellites left in orbit. Over time, the name Advex-mors faded from common stellar charts, replaced with a simple designation marking it as a restricted system. Subsequent investigations by the Adeptus Administratum confirmed that the data recovered from the campaign's aftermath provided critical insights into Rangdan physiology and strategic doctrine. Among the key findings were that Rangdan command structures operated through bio-linked hierarchies, that their energy technology was based on self-generating resonance rather than static power cells, and that their understanding of neural manipulation far exceeded Imperial limits. The discovery that their civilization maintained slave populations of multiple species indicated a level of interstellar reach that challenged the existing mapping of known space. The conclusion drawn by the Mechanicum and Administratum analysts was that Advex-mors had not been the core of the Rangdan domain, but merely one of its frontier bastions. That conclusion altered the strategic posture of the Imperium. It prompted the reallocation of multiple expeditionary fleets towards sectors previously considered secure and accelerated the development of xenocidal doctrines that emphasized preemptive annihilation over negotiation or subjugation. The classification Rangdan Protocol entered Imperial lexicons to describe any campaign where an enemy species was to be destroyed in entirety rather than conquered. This terminology would appear repeatedly in subsequent Crusade-era documents, though rarely accompanied by full context. Material evidence recovered from the site later played a role in shaping Imperial science policy. Samples of the Rangdan alloys remained active long after exposure to atmosphere, generating faint energy readings that could not be explained by any known physical model. When Mechanicum researchers attempted to store them within containment fields, the materials exhibited spontaneous dimensional displacement, vanishing for microseconds before reappearing intact. This phenomenon led to the hypothesis that Rangdan matter incorporated dimensional harmonics unknown to human science. The discovery was suppressed by order of the Fabricator General and later classified under the sealed Mechanicum archive designation Theta Rho Xenos. From the perspective of human cost and strategic outcome, the Battle of Advex-mors remains a paradox. It stands as one of the Imperium's most decisive victories, and yet one of its least satisfying. The First Legion proved its resilience, restored its standing, and eliminated a tangible threat. but the engagement exposed a wider and more complex enemy whose true extent could not be measured. The destruction of the Rangdan war moon and the cleansing of the system ended the first phase of the conflict, yet the knowledge gained from those ruins ensured that the Imperium's perception of the galaxy's dangers would never again be the same. Later Administratum compilations describe Advex-mors as the seed world of dread. This phrase refers not to the horror inflicted by the Rangda, but to the psychological impact the campaign had upon Imperial command. The awareness that an entire civilization of such scale and sophistication could exist beyond the Imperium's reach fostered an enduring anxiety within the hierarchy of terror. This anxiety influenced both the secrecy surrounding subsequent xenocides and the administrative censorship that later obscured many details of the conflict. When later scholars attempted to reconstruct the events, they found records incomplete, reports redacted, and evidence of deliberate data purging within both the Mechanicum and Inquisition archives. Among the key findings consolidated by the Mechanicum and the Administratum were several enduring truths. The Rangda were not a rogue species, but an organized interstellar power. Their mastery of neural and biomechanical sciences represented a form of technology that blurred the boundary between organism and machine. Their use of enslaved populations demonstrated a strategic disregard for life, unmatched by any other known civilization. Most importantly, their defeat at Advex-mors revealed both the strength and fragility of the Imperium, its ability to mobilize overwhelming force when united, and its vulnerability to the corrosive effects of prolonged attritional warfare against an enemy capable of adapting faster than human comprehension. By the time the final Imperial transport departed from the ruins of Advex-mors, the planet had become a dead sphere, its atmosphere stripped and its surface burned to glass. What remained were archives, picked feeds, and debris fields, whose silent testimony continued to inform Imperial doctrine for centuries to come. In the official records of the Great Crusade, the engagement was catalogued as the First Rangdan Xenocide. Later historians would dispute whether it deserved the term xenocide at all, arguing that the species survived beyond the reach of Imperial retribution. Regardless, the designation endured. Thus ended the Battle of Advex-mors. It established the pattern for the wars that would follow, defined the Imperium's policy of annihilation against the Rangda, and laid the groundwork for the secrecy and fear that would accompany every subsequent mention of their name. The records recovered, preserved, and translated into the archives of the Imperium stand as both warning and memorial, a chronicle of victory purchased at immeasurable cost, and the beginning of a greater darkness that would soon engulf the stars. Thus ended the Battle of Advex-mors. It established the pattern for the wars that would follow, defined the Imperium's policy of annihilation against the Rangda, and laid the groundwork for the secrecy and fear that would accompany every subsequent mention of their name. The records recovered, preserved, and translated into the archives of the Imperium stand as both warning and memorial, a chronicle of victory purchased at immeasurable cost, and the beginning of a greater darkness that would soon engulf the stars. Thus ended the Battle of Advex-mors. It established the pattern for the wars that would follow, defined the Imperium's policy of annihilation against the Rangda, and laid the groundwork for the secrecy and fear that would accompany every subsequent mention of their name. The records recovered, preserved, and translated into the archives of the Imperium stand as both warning and memorial, a chronicle of victory purchased at immeasurable cost, and the beginning of a greater darkness that would soon engulf the stars. The review compiled by the Adeptus Administratum following the Battle of Advex-mors occupies 8 volumes of analysis, 3 of which are dedicated solely to statistical reconciliation. The Administratum's mandate in this context was not celebration or memorial, but accounting. Every expenditure of material, life and fuel was to be weighed against its measurable outcome. The Mechanicum's corresponding report, transmitted under the seal of the Fabricator General, provided an alternate but parallel assessment, a record not of cost, but of knowledge gained. Together, these 2 bodies of documentation formed the first administrative model for large-scale xenocidal warfare in the Great Crusade. Administratum scribes calculated that the total logistical expenditure of the campaign reached levels previously considered unsustainable for a single theatre engagement. The fleet that departed Zana II consumed approximately 130 billion litres of plasma fuel during transit and orbital operations, with a further 30 billion allocated to atmospheric vehicles and planetary mechanised divisions. The production records of forged satellites in the Zana cluster confirm the mobilisation of over 12 million tons of munitions within the first month of the campaign. These numbers were later used to set new standards for expeditionary resupply quotas in xenocidal class operations. The Adeptus Mechanicus approached these figures with characteristic detachment. For the Magi Logi, energy expenditure was merely a factor within a wider equation, the study of mechanical efficiency in the face of alien resistance. They concluded that the rate of material loss had exceeded projection not because of strategic failure, but due to the unique properties of Rangdan defensive technologies. The Rangdan fortresses absorbed kinetic and thermal energy with minimal deformation, forcing the First Legion to escalate firepower far beyond standard siege requirements. Even plasma weaponry, designed to sublimate armour on molecular scales, achieved only partial penetration against the composite alloys used by the Xenos. This inefficiency became one of the key findings in the Mechanicum's Annex report, recorded under the designation Material Inefficacy Protocols of Advex-mors. The Mechanicum's internal records indicate fascination bordering on reverence toward the recovered Rangdan technology. Data fragments extracted from the War Moon's ruins displayed energy harmonics incompatible with Imperial field theory. Mechanicum seers reported encountering power signatures that shifted frequency when observed, leading to the temporary corruption of several data scrying servitors. Subsequent analysis conducted aboard the cruiser Omniscient Votum determined that Rangdan energy cores operated not through stored charge, but through resonance between crystalline matrices and the surrounding environment. This system effectively transformed ambient radiation, electromagnetic noise, and thermal variation into continuous power, a closed-loop energy cycle that defied standard thermodynamic limitations. The discovery prompted immediate classification and restriction, as it represented a potential heresy of science in Mechanicum doctrine. From the perspective of the Administratum, such anomalies were catalogued in purely logistical terms. The report lists a series of failed attempts to transport intact Rangdan equipment to secure laboratories. In every case, containment fields destabilized or the material simply disintegrated during transit. These incidents, while scientific tragedies to the Mechanicum, became bureaucratic data points to the Administratum. The official record notes unrecoverable loss due to contamination, a phrase that appears over 200 times across the 8 volumes. This bureaucratic neutrality masks the growing tension between the Mechanicum's desire for knowledge and the Administratum's insistence on procedural containment. Fleet reports from the closing phase of the campaign indicate severe degradation of Imperial supply lines. The initial logistical model assumed a campaign duration of 6 standard weeks. It extended to nearly 4 months. Fuel reserves dwindled as ships remained in low orbit to provide constant fire support. Ammunition reserves fell by 30% before the siege operations concluded, forcing the fleet's armourers to repurpose munitions from damaged vessels. Administratum quartermasters identified these improvisations as violations of codified supply doctrines, yet later recognised them as necessary precedents for adaptive logistics in hostile environments. The campaign became a case study cited in later Crusade-era training archives under the heading Adaptive Resupply Doctrine, Advex case. On the surface, Mechanicum detachments recorded significant mechanical attrition among the Thanatar siege engines and Myrmidon detachments deployed to breach the Rangdan fortresses. Of the 50 Thanatar-class constructs initially deployed, 17 were destroyed, and a further 9 rendered permanently inoperative due to crystalline feedback interference. Investigation revealed that Rangdan weaponry emitted variable frequency pulses capable of overloading plasma reactors. These pulses were described as sonic in nature, though measurements showed them operating beyond conventional sound wavelengths. The Mechanicum termed this effect harmonic destabilization, concluding that the Xenos exploited a physical resonance property of their environment to neutralize human technology. In subsequent years, Mechanicum research divisions attempted to reproduce this phenomenon without success. Administratum casualty accounting exhibits the precision expected of its functionaries, though the completeness of the data is questionable. Approximately 10,000 Astartes of the First Legion perished during the campaign, along with nearly 70% of human auxiliary forces. Mechanicum losses were recorded as non-standard attrition, a classification used when the total number of casualties cannot be confirmed due to disintegration, incineration, or psychic interference. The phrase appears frequently in the margins of Mechanicum reports, accompanied by glyphs indicating reverence rather than mourning. To the Adeptus Mechanicus, the dissolution of machine and mind into unknown energy states was interpreted as a form of sacred data offering to the Omnissiah. The Administratum viewed the same phenomena as evidence of contamination risk. Entire battalions were quarantined after exposure to the War Moon's debris field. Medicae inspections discovered mutations in the neural tissues of personnel who had come into contact with Rangdan matter, though these mutations were non-transmissible and caused no apparent cognitive damage. The report simply notes neural lattice interference and orders the affected individuals transferred to restricted duty. Later Inquisition files would identify these personnel as among the first documented victims of low-level Xenos techno-corruption, though such designations were applied retrospectively centuries later. The Mechanicum's internal memoranda reveal ambivalence toward the Adeptus Administratum's attempts to classify the campaign as a straightforward logistical success. For the Magi, the data recovered outweighed all material losses. Each destroyed engine, each vaporized servitor represented an offering in the quest for understanding. Their final communique to the Fabricator General described Advex-mors not as a victory or a defeat, but as an awakening to forms of knowledge beyond sanctioned comprehension. The Administratum's summation, by contrast, concluded with the statement, "Objective achieved. Enemy annihilated. Resource expenditure acceptable within tolerance range." The two sentences capture the cultural divide between faith in the machine god and faith in bureaucracy. A particularly detailed annex of the Mechanicum report concerns the performance of the 3 Gloriana-class battleships. The Invincible Reason and Truth's Razor survived the campaign but sustained critical structural compromise. Their void shields exhibited rapid decay under sustained Rangdan bombardment, prompting an internal review of Imperial shield harmonics. It was discovered that the Shadow Blaster weapons utilized by the Rangda did not function as traditional energy beams, but as packets of coherent electromagnetic interference, inducing subatomic destabilization in void field generators. The paradigm of Hate's destruction, previously considered heroic, was reassessed by the Mechanicum as a necessary response to unavoidable systemic failure. Had it not rammed the War Moon, the ship's compromised plasma core might have detonated spontaneously due to accumulated interference. This retrospective analysis transformed what was once mythic sacrifice into an engineering inevitability. Administratum Logiclarks later incorporated this data into an internal publication on fleet resilience. They recommended modifications to standard void shield frequency rotation protocols, establishing a precedent that would influence Imperial ship design for centuries. Although the Rangda's technology was ultimately destroyed, the information gleaned from its effects contributed directly to the refinement of human naval architecture. In this sense, even annihilated Xenos left their mark upon Imperial progress. On the planetary front, the Mechanicum's analysis of the siege engine's performance produced a wealth of technical adjustments. The Thanatar siege automata that survived were found to have microfractures in their armor plating, caused not by impact but by interference resonance. The data collected from these fractures led to the development of adaptive harmonic damping systems, later employed during the Horus Heresy to counter traitor energy weapons. This lineage of technology traces directly to the discoveries at Advex-mors, though it is rarely acknowledged in official Mechanicum records due to the association with prohibited Xenos sources. Administratum summaries also highlight the campaign's impact on record-keeping and information control. The staggering amount of data generated during the battle overwhelmed existing archival systems. Reports from voxcasters, telemetry logs, casualty manifests, and requisition ledgers flooded administrative nodes, causing multiple relay cogitators to overload. The crisis forced the implementation of a new hierarchical data structure known as tri-tier codification, a method that categorized incoming data into primary, secondary, and tertiary importance before storage. This system, first deployed at Advex-mors, became the foundation for Imperial data management across future Crusade fleets. In a bureaucratic sense, the Rangda conflict accelerated administrative evolution. The Mechanicum, however, viewed the data crisis differently. Magos Loge's commentary indicates that the sudden influx of sensory and battlefield telemetry caused cognitive overload in connected machine spirits. Several cogitators experienced what the Mechanicum described as data cascade delirium, a state in which the machine attempted to reconcile incompatible sensory inputs and began producing self-referential patterns. This behavior alarmed the overseeing tech priests, who interpreted it as evidence that the data itself carried anomalous frequencies. The discovery was deemed too dangerous for replication, and all affected systems were ritually purged with consecrated plasma fire. In parallel, the Administratum performed a full audit of resource allocation to determine the campaign's efficiency ratio. They found that despite the staggering expenditure, the operational efficiency remained within a 15% deviation from predicted values. However, they noted that the efficiency ratio only remained stable because the Astartes required minimal logistical support compared to conventional human troops. If the campaign had been fought by regular army formations alone, the cost would have been unsustainable. The finding reinforced the necessity of the Legion's Astartes as the Imperium's primary instrument of deep space warfare. Mechanicum Magi corroborated this conclusion, though for different reasons. They noted that the Astartes' gene-enhanced physiology allowed them to operate in contaminated environments where human personnel would have perished. This efficiency minimized the need for environmental adaptation protocols and enabled continuous offensive momentum. The Mechanicum calculated that the Astartes' metabolic efficiency reduced overall sustenance consumption by 60% compared to human equivalents, a number later cited in multiple treatises advocating for increased Astartes production. Ironically, the data from a battle fought against a genocidal alien species would later justify humanity's own escalation of genetic warfare. Perhaps the most striking section of the joint reports concerns the differing interpretations of the Rangda's defeat. The Administratium recorded the campaign as a closed event, categorizing the enemy as eradicated. The Mechanicum refused to accept that designation. Their rationale rested upon a single observation: the disappearance of several Rangdan vessels during the final days of the campaign. These ships vanished without detectable warp translation, suggesting a form of transit technology unknown to the Imperium. The Mechanicum's report warns that such an anomaly implied the survival of the species beyond recorded observation. This disagreement foreshadowed the intellectual divide that would characterize the Imperium's later dealings with the Inquisition, whose records would eventually validate the Mechanicum's caution. In the economic aftermath, the Administratum calculated that rebuilding and refueling the fleet would take approximately 9 years at standard production rates. To expedite recovery, resources were redirected from nearby compliance operations, delaying multiple Crusade objectives. These reallocations provoked friction between regional commanders and Administratum logisticians, though central oversight accepted the delays as a necessary sacrifice. The cost-benefit analysis attached to the final report concluded with a statement that has been cited repeatedly in later centuries. Victory at Advex-mors ensured survival, but not sustainability. For the Mechanicum, sustainability was never the question. Their focus lay in the patterns hidden within the enemy's technology. Magos Xenology's treatises written after the campaign described the Rangda as a civilization operating beyond the binary logic of the machine god's teachings. Their constructs were neither fully mechanical nor organic, but existed in a hybrid state that responded to observation. The Magi interpreted this as evidence of self-adaptive design, a principle that would later inspire limited mechanicum experiments into semi-autonomous machine consciousness. Those experiments were later prescribed by the Order Reductor and expunged from official archives. When cross-referenced, the two factions' reports present an almost philosophical divergence. The Administratum viewed the campaign as a test of human endurance and supply chain resilience. The Mechanicum regarded it as a glimpse into forbidden truths about creation and adaptation. Where the Administratum sought closure, the Mechanicum found only more questions. This dichotomy defines the tone of the surviving archival correspondence. Each page bears the weight of competing priorities: control versus curiosity, containment versus exploration. Ultimately, the conclusions drawn by both the Administratum and the Mechanicum would shape the Imperium's next response to the Rangda threat. The Administratum called for increased fleet reserves, broader supply depots, and stricter oversight on expenditure. The Mechanicum called for further study, arguing that understanding the enemy's technologies was essential to countering them effectively. Both recommendations were adopted in part, but their coexistence created an enduring bureaucratic paradox. The Imperium's war machine was commanded to destroy what it most needed to understand. Thus, from the twin lenses of administration and machine, the Battle of Advex-mors emerged not merely as a military event but as a logistical crucible. It exposed the limits of human organization, the vulnerabilities of sacred technology, and the persistence of knowledge even in annihilation. For the Adeptus Administratum, it was a ledger balanced in blood and fuel. For the Adeptus Mechanicus, it was a revelation sealed beneath the stamp of the Omnissiah. Both saw order in the ashes, yet neither comprehended the full magnitude of what had been unleashed. The compiled combat records from the Battle of Advex-mors occupy a distinct section of the joint Administratum Mechanicus archive designated Tactici Xenocidus Primus. Within it are preserved the only verified analyses of the fighting methods employed by both the First Legion and the Rangda species during the first recorded xenocidal conflict of the Great Crusade. The document's tone is clinical, devoid of celebration or grief. It presents war as sequence and metric, an accumulation of probabilities converted into data. The Administratum identified 6 major battle events within the wider campaign, each catalogued according to spatial coordinates, duration, and casualty density. These included the orbital engagement over Advex-mors Primus, the siege of the hydrogen mines, the rout of the Outer Worlds, the Battle of the Outlands, the collapse of the equatorial fortresses, and the purge of the War Moon. Each of these engagements offered data unique to the study of xenocidal warfare, revealing the adaptive tendencies of both human and Xenos forces when pressed beyond normal operational parameters. The Mechanicum approached the same sequence differently. Their interest lay in the mechanics of combat, the exchange of energy, the performance of machinery, the interface between biology and weaponry. The records they preserved allow reconstruction of how the First Legion and the Rangda each defined war. For humanity, it was the art of control and order. For the Rangda, it was the practice of entropy weaponized into strategy. The opening phase, the orbital engagement over Advex-mors Primus, remains one of the most studied fleet actions of the Crusade era. Mechanicum telemetry preserved aboard the Invincible Reason reveals that the Rangda void craft operated without discernible command latency. Their formations shifted simultaneously, reacting to Imperial maneuvers with precision beyond the limits of human coordination. Subsequent analysis determined that the Rangda employed bioreactive command systems, living cores capable of interpreting and transmitting tactical data instantaneously. This allowed their vessels to function as a single distributed organism rather than a collection of ships. In contrast, the First Legion's fleet operated under hierarchical doctrine, each capital ship directed by Vox-encoded command chains and machine spirit mediation. The Imperial advantage lay in discipline and gunnery calibration, not instinctive synchronization. The Mechanicum noted that despite inferior reaction speed, the humans achieved local superiority through overwhelming fire concentration and coordinated target prioritization. Fleet commanders treated each Rangdan vessel as a node within a network. Sever enough nodes, and the collective response degraded. When the paradigm of hate executed its terminal ramming maneuver, the network collapsed entirely. Mechanicum theorists later described this act as an unintentional example of tactical severance, the exploitation of a biological logic system by purely mechanical means. Following the orbital phase came the siege of the hydrogen mines on Advex-mors Extremis. Administratum records describe it as the campaign's first confirmed ground operation and the earliest instance of direct combat between Astartes and Rangdan thralls. The terrain was glacial, the surface fractured by deep fissures venting subcrustal gas. The First Legion's 8th chapter established drop zones across an area 20 kilometers in diameter. Their approach followed the hammerline advance doctrine: heavy infantry in front, fast reconnaissance on the flanks, long-range support in orbit. The Rangda responded by flooding the ice tunnels with tens of thousands of neural thralls, driven into berserker states by overstimulated collars. Mechanicum sensor arrays detected synchronized neural pulses traveling through the sub-ice strata, indicating centralized control. The slaves moved as one organism, their vital signs fluctuating in uniform rhythm. The Astartes responded with precision volleys, each bolt shell detonating at preset distances to maximize fragmentation in confined tunnels. Casualty ratios recorded by Administratum analysts show approximately 10,000 thralls neutralized for every 200 Astartes lost. Yet the victory carried strategic cost. The tunnels collapsed, destroying valuable infrastructure. The Mechanicum deemed the engagement a technical failure but biological success, meaning that while the refinery was rendered inoperable, it provided the first measurable data on Rangdan control systems. The rout of the Outer Worlds constituted the next sequence of operations. Over 4 barren planets, the First Legion conducted systematic extermination campaigns lasting several weeks. Each world presented varying ecological conditions but similar defense patterns, slave legions directed by isolated Rangdan overseers. The Legion divided its forces into planetary task groups, each composed of approximately 1,000 Astartes supported by mechanized detachments. The combat doctrine employed combined orbital interdiction and precision surface assaults. Mechanicum flight logs indicate an average landing accuracy deviation of less than 30 meters, a testament to the fleet's navigational synchronization despite constant jamming interference from the Rangda's electromagnetic weaponry. Administratum clerks noted a disturbing phenomenon observed during these sub-campaigns. The slain thralls often exhibited post-mortem convulsions, as though residual neural impulses persisted beyond death. The Mechanicum attributed this to delayed neural feedback loops in the collars, which continued to transmit command signals until power depletion. The result was psychological strain on Imperial infantry, forced to witness the reanimation of corpses still clutching weapons. Astartes apothecaries implemented countermeasures by severing the neural collars during cleanup operations, ensuring termination of post-mortem activity. The incident later informed Mechanicum protocols regarding Xenos control implants and became a case study in field deactivation of alien neural technologies. The largest and most tactically complex ground battle of the campaign, the Battle of the Outlands, has been reconstructed in considerable detail from recovered pict feeds and telemetry logs. Spanning a 100-kilometer front of jagged basalt plains, it represented the point at which the First Legion faced the full weight of the Rangdan's primary army. Administratum chronologists measured the engagement's duration at approximately 70 hours of continuous combat. The battle unfolded in 3 phases: initial slave wave assaults, secondary Rangdan elite intervention, and the final decisive melee between Grandmaster Urian Vendraig and the Rangdan warmaster. The fighting style of the First Legion during this engagement displayed the hallmarks of tyrannic warfare refined by centuries of conquest. Formations operated in disciplined lockstep, emphasizing interlocking fields of fire, minimal lateral exposure, and constant communication between hosts. Tactical formations resembled geometric progressions, each company moving as a single mathematical expression across the field. The Mechanicum commented that their pattern resembled a data array processing function, efficiently distributing firepower while minimizing redundancy. The Legion's precision contrasted sharply with the chaotic violence of the enemy. The Rangda's fighting style defied simple categorization. They exhibited animalistic ferocity combined with tactical intellect. When their slave legions failed to penetrate the Astartes lines, they advanced personally, deploying in trios and quads with overlapping energy shields that absorbed incoming fire. Their weapons were crystalline constructs, emitting coherent plasma arcs capable of melting ceramite armor. Combat telemetry shows that a single Rangdan warrior could absorb the attention of multiple Astartes before being brought down. Their movements were fluid, almost anticipatory. Mechanicum analysis suggested that their neural processing speed exceeded human reaction time by measurable factors. To counter this, the Astartes adapted, relying on predictive targeting and squad-level synergy to overcome the disparity. During the third phase of the battle, Grandmaster Vendraig's decision to commit his reserves marked the turning point. Recognizing that the Rangda's elites were concentrating around their command nexus, he led a direct charge through the fragmented remains of the slave armies. Sensor readings from his armor's combat log confirm exposure to multiple energy strikes and neurotoxin penetration before the decisive duel. The Mechanicum extracted the data to study the Astartes' biostabilization systems, noting that Vendraig's enhanced organs maintained function despite systemic poisoning. His victory over the Warmaster caused immediate disruption in Rangdan coordination, validating the Imperial hypothesis that their command structures were centralized and biologically synchronized. The aftermath of the Outlands engagement left the battlefield saturated with residual radiation and chemical contamination. Mechanicum servitors deployed for cleanup recorded fluctuating energy fields persisting for days, implying that Rangdan technology continued to operate autonomously even after its operators were dead. The discovery reinforced the classification of their technology as semi-sentient, a conclusion that would later influence the Mechanicum's reluctance to employ captured artifacts in any capacity. The following operation, the collapse of the Equatorial Fortresses, represents the campaign's transition from open warfare to systematic annihilation. The Administratum defined these engagements as kinetic eradication sieges. The First Legion established concentric encirclements around each fortress, employing orbital bombardment synchronized with ground artillery barrages. The Mechanicum's field reports describe this synchronization as the most precise recorded in Crusade history, with fire sequences calibrated to millisecond intervals. The fortresses themselves presented defensive systems unlike anything previously encountered. Energy domes that regenerated from absorbed projectile impact, walls composed of living metal that reconfigured under stress, and internal drone systems that self-replicated from raw material. The Astartes countered with massed plasma fire, demolitions, and direct boarding assaults through breaches opened by Thanatar siege engines. Mechanicum combat engineers documented the destruction process in technical detail. When the final fortress fell, its internal power systems imploded, releasing a pulse that disabled communications across the planet for 30 minutes. The pulse exhibited harmonic frequencies that matched those of the earlier Shadow Blaster weapons, suggesting a unified technological architecture across Rangdan systems. The Mechanicum classified this finding as resonance continuum hypothesis, theorizing that all Rangdan machines operated as extensions of a single planetary network. If correct, the annihilation of the fortresses equated to the neural death of the planet itself. The purge of the War Moon occurred concurrently in orbit. After the Paradigm of Hate's detonation crippled the structure, boarding parties of Breacher and Destroyer cadres re-entered the remains to neutralize surviving Rangda. Their pict feeds depict corridors warped by gravitational shear, where fragments of the battleship's hull fused with alien metal. Combat within the wreckage was characterized by near-zero visibility and unstable gravity wells. The Mechanicum log designates the engagement as non-linear combat environment, meaning that spatial orientation could not be consistently maintained. Despite these hazards, the Breachers succeeded in eradicating remaining Xeno's presence within 6 hours of continuous fighting. radiation exposure among Imperial forces reached levels considered fatal for unaugmented humans, yet the data they collected provided unprecedented insight into the internal workings of Rangdan megastructures. In studying these engagements collectively, the Administratum identified recurring tactical principles on both sides. The Imperium's success derived from centralized command, redundancy of supply, and the capacity for coordinated mass assault. The Rangda's strength lay in adaptability, distributed intelligence, and the capacity to weaponize their environment. Each faction embodied opposing philosophies of war. The Astartes fought with precision and ritual discipline, every strike measured, every formation predetermined. The Rangda fought with fluid intelligence, each warrior a node in an organic algorithm of destruction. The collision of these paradigms generated the extreme casualty figures recorded across the campaign. Mechanicum analysis of combat telemetry further revealed the psychological dimensions of both forces. Astartes' bio-monitoring data showed minimal deviation in stress indicators even during the heaviest fighting. Their endocrine systems maintained equilibrium, a trait interpreted by the Mechanicum as near-machine perfection. Rangdan physiological readings gathered posthumously displayed extreme fluctuations, rapid surges in neural activity followed by total synaptic collapse at death. Magos biologists concluded that the Rangda's combat state represented a form of self-consuming overdrive, suggesting that they burned through their own neural energy to achieve temporary superiority in speed and strength. This trait reinforced the hypothesis that the species' warfare philosophy accepted extinction as a tactical cost. Among the more notable minor battles within the campaign, the descent at Meridian Trench offers rare insight into close-quarters adaptation. A detachment of the Host of Wind pursued retreating Rangdan elements into a canyon network. The Rangda activated environmental control mechanisms, altering atmospheric pressure and creating localized storms of metallic dust. The Astartes armor filters struggled to compensate, reducing visibility to near zero. Despite technological disadvantage, the Legion adapted by employing auditory triangulation protocols, using helmet auspex to locate sound patterns generated by enemy movement. The subsequent melee was fought blind, guided entirely by sound and instinct. Mechanicum observers later referred to this as an example of human cognitive plasticity exceeding machine prediction, a finding that unsettled several Magos Logi who regarded it as irrational data behavior. Each engagement documented by the Administratum contributed to an aggregate understanding of how the First Legion operated at its height. The Legion's tactical doctrine emphasized three constant values: initiative through aggression, control through discipline, and victory through endurance. The Mechanicum described these values as algorithmic constants within the Legion's collective psyche. Their combat style did not fluctuate with circumstance. Instead, it imposed structure upon chaos until the enemy's capacity for disorder was exhausted. Against the Rangda, this philosophy met its equal and survived, but not unaltered. The Legion that emerged from Advex-mors had learned to fight a war not of conquest, but of extermination. From the Mechanicum's analytical standpoint, every battle within the campaign served as a field laboratory. Each weapon discharge, each machine failure, each biological reaction was recorded and dissected. Their post-action review lists over 48,000 individual data points, covering variables from energy output to atmospheric interference. This exhaustive record would later inform the construction of the Xenocidal Tactici lexicon, a classified reference reserved for the highest levels of the Crusade's command structure. Within its pages, the Battle of Advex-mors stands not as legend but as mathematical precedent, the moment when war ceased to be art and became pure computation. Administratum historians closed their account of the campaign's notable battles with a statement that reads more like a ledger than a conclusion. 6 worlds subdued, 1 war moon destroyed, 1 species eradicated to the limits of observation. Yet even within that detached summary lies the implicit acknowledgement that war against the Rangda had redefined the parameters of Imperial warfare. In the crucible of Advex-mors, humanity encountered an enemy whose fighting style mirrored its own in precision and conviction, and in overcoming it inherited part of its reflection. Thus, the record of the notable battles and their methods remains preserved not for celebration but for calibration. Each engagement demonstrates how close the Imperium came to mechanical perfection, and how thin the boundary was between victory and obliteration. The Adeptus Mechanicus regards this data as proof that efficiency can conquer even the alien unknown. The Administratum regards it as proof that efficiency alone is never enough. Between those interpretations lies the truth of Advex-mors, a war fought with exactitude so absolute that it stripped meaning from triumph itself. In the closing months of the Advex-mors campaign, combat records became increasingly fragmented. Administratum transcribers noted growing discrepancies between field reports and Mechanicus data, an effect attributed to signal degradation, but later considered evidence of wider systemic collapse across the warfront. By that stage, the First Legion had transformed from an organised expeditionary army into a network of autonomous hosts operating on partial communication loops. The Rangda, having lost their war moon and command hierarchies, fragmented into scattered clusters of resistance across the system. These final confrontations were smaller in scale, but exhibited ferocity equal to the first engagements. The Outer Meridian conflicts mark one such series of battles. These occurred along the periphery of the Advex-mors system's debris field, where remnants of the war moon structure orbited as unstable fragments. Administratum records identify 3 primary combat zones, each associated with significant losses in material and personnel. The engagements consisted of void sweeps conducted by destroyer cadres and Mechanicus Scitarii, tasked with eradicating any residual Xenos presence. Their targets were not fleets, but autonomous weapons, machines of indeterminate size operating on energy signatures identical to those of Rangdan control nodes. Mechanica Mag records described these encounters as post-cognitive events, meaning that the alien devices displayed awareness of incoming forces before detection occurred. The machines adjusted orbits, concealed energy emissions, and ambushed boarding craft with gravitational distortions. The fighting took place in total darkness, illuminated only by the exhaust flares of burning reactors. Vox transmissions captured during these operations contained static distortions later matched to bioacoustic patterns from living Rangdan. This led some within the Mechanicum to hypothesize that fragments of the species' neural data had survived within the war moon systems, animating its remaining architecture. The Administratum dismissed the theory as metaphor, cataloguing the events instead as standard debris clearance actions. The discrepancy between interpretations remains unresolved. Following the Meridian conflicts, attention shifted to Advex-mors Tertius, a smaller world used by the Rangda as a logistic outpost. Mechanicum survey probes detected residual power readings across the equatorial regions, evidence of subterranean installations still active despite the orbital devastation. The First Legion's 6th host conducted a ground incursion, descending into kilometre-deep shafts carved directly into the planet's mantle. The environment within was lethally hostile, temperatures exceeding 500 degrees, oxygen displacement by reactive gases, and seismic instability caused by damaged core extractors. Despite these conditions, the Astartes advanced, encountering automated defense drones that operated independently of any known command source. These machines exhibited adaptive camouflage and utilized sonic weaponry that disrupted internal organics even through power armor. The battle within the shafts lasted less than 3 hours, but resulted in catastrophic damage to the planetary infrastructure. When the final generators detonated, the world's crust collapsed inward, consuming the installation and sealing the tunnels. Administratum estimates list 50 Astartes and 300 Mechanicum personnel lost, along with all surface installations. Yet the campaign was considered strategically successful. The destruction of Tertius eliminated the last confirmed energy relay between the Advex-mors system and the wider Rangdan network. The next recorded action, referred to as the cleansing of the Umbral Belt, demonstrates the changing nature of Imperial warfare as the Xenocide neared conclusion. The umbral belt was a circumplanetary ring of rock and metallic dust, orbiting Advex-mors Secundus. It contained numerous artificial structures that the Mechanicum initially believed to be mining platforms. Subsequent analysis revealed them to be incubation sites, vast biological factories that had once produced Rangdan thralls. When the First Legion arrived, the facilities had been abandoned, but residual energy readings persisted. Boarding parties found corridors lined with inert forms suspended in nutrient gel, partially developed and malformed. The Mechanicum classified these as incomplete replication attempts, the remains of a reproductive cycle interrupted by the loss of the War Moon's command frequency. The destruction of these facilities required coordinated demolition. Administratum records list 42 separate detonations carried out over a period of 78 hours, resulting in total vaporization of the belt's inner structure. The Mechanicum noted fluctuations in local gravity during the process, implying that the organic masses within the stations had begun to interact with nearby matter fields, an anomaly they were unable to reproduce or explain. These readings were redacted in later publications, with only fragmentary references surviving in the classified appendices of the Xenocidal After-Action archive. Another engagement, the Descent of Carthus Reach, illustrates the logistical endurance of the campaign's latter stages. Carthus Reach was a small moon with a low orbital decay trajectory, slated for atmospheric entry within 2 months. Instead of evacuating, the First Legion deployed to eradicate the remaining Rangdan forces entrenched within. Administratum field reports describe the operation as a reclamation of inevitability. The fighting occurred on a world already dying, the surface cracking under gravitational strain while magma plumes erupted through the crust. Despite unstable ground, the Legion maintained formation integrity. Drop pods landed directly into enemy entrenchments, initiating close-quarters engagements amid earthquakes and collapsing terrain. The Rangda employed psionic interference devices that distorted visual and auditory perception. Combat logs record multiple instances of Astartes reporting hallucinated duplicates of their own comrades attacking them. The Mechanicum later confirmed that these were not illusions but localized gravitational distortions refracting light and sound. The Legion adapted by closing visors to blackout mode, relying entirely on Auspex readings. The battle concluded with the complete collapse of the moon's surface. The surviving Imperial forces evacuated moments before atmospheric entry. Mechanicum observers recorded that the collapsing moon emitted an electromagnetic pulse detected across several systems, final evidence of the Rangda's attempt to weaponize their own extinction. The cumulative data from these secondary wars formed the foundation of the Adeptus Mechanicus post-campaign analytics. Their evaluation divided the Advex-mors conflict into 2 categories: structured engagements and entropy engagements. The first described battles fought under Imperial command logic, planned, measured, and recorded. The second referred to encounters that defied prediction, where enemy behavior or environmental conditions disrupted all known patterns. Approximately 48% of the recorded engagements fell into the latter classification. This ratio became a cautionary standard in future xenocidal assessments. The Mechanicum used it to estimate the threshold at which control transitioned to chaos. Administratum clerks, meanwhile, compiled the broader casualty metrics. Across all phases of the Battle of Advex-mors and its associated operations, they recorded losses of nearly 10,000 Astartes, 50,000 auxiliary troops, and close to 1 million Mechanicum servitors and personnel. Fleet attrition reached 50 capital ships destroyed and over 200 damaged beyond repair. Rangdan casualties could not be accurately determined, but were estimated in the billions across multiple worlds and installations. The Administratum declared the system sanitized on the 16th day of the 9th month, following the War Moon's destruction. The immediate aftermath saw an influx of Mechanicum survey ships dispatched to catalogue remaining artifacts. Their task was to recover technologies suitable for study without violating the Treaty of Olympus, which forbade the adoption of non-human constructs into Imperial machine systems. Thousands of items were logged: weapon fragments, genetic samples, residual energy cores, and unidentified crystalline components. The Mechanicum's evaluation teams classified 96% of these as non-replicable or hazardous. The remaining 4% were secured and transferred to Mars for dissection. No further information regarding their analysis has ever been released, leading to speculation that several discoveries were either destroyed or integrated covertly into Mechanicum research programs. Administratum auditors overseeing the campaign's conclusion described the human toll in precise bureaucratic language. Each lost world was assigned an economic reclamation index, measuring how long it would take for Imperial industry to recover the value of materials expended. For Advex-mors Primus, the index exceeded 100 standard years. For the War Moon operation, recovery was deemed impossible. Despite this, the campaign was categorized as a strategic success, its lessons incorporated into future extermination doctrines. The concluding statement of the official report reads, "The Battle of Advex-mors confirms the efficiency of unified command and the necessity of calculated annihilation." From the Mechanicus perspective, the aftermath presented opportunities beyond immediate victory. Magos Logi divisions began compiling the Tactici Xenocidus dataset, combining combat telemetry, biological dissections, and material analyses into a single codified archive. The data revealed recurring harmonic frequencies within Rangdan technologies, specifically a resonance pattern identical across energy weapons, shield generators, and power cores. The discovery suggested that all Rangdan systems operated through a universal principle of waveform harmonization, where biological and mechanical components shared identical energy states. This contradicted human engineering, which relied on compartmentalization and separation between organic and machine functions. The implications unsettled many within the Mechanicum hierarchy. Some argued that the Rangda represented a form of technological evolution that had achieved total unity between flesh and machine. Others warned that this very unity was the source of their collapse. Once the biological element was destroyed, the mechanical followed. The data remained sealed under the Decree Magenta, limiting access to select Magi-biologists and Archdominus researchers. What information survived in public Mechanicum archives was sanitized, referencing only harmonic coherence anomalies without acknowledging their biological correlation. The planetary aftermath of Advex-mors offered similar contradictions. Mechanicum explorators who revisited the surface decades later reported that the radiation levels had stabilized, but that residual energy patterns persisted in the soil. Instruments detected electromagnetic pulses recurring at regular intervals, as though remnants of the Rangdan network continued to transmit across empty space. No receivers were ever found. Administratum expeditions attempted to establish mining colonies, but within months, machinery malfunctioned inexplicably. Vox systems emitted rhythmic signals matching the same pulse frequency. The colonies were evacuated and the system declared interdicted. In the centuries following, the Adeptus Mechanicus designated Advex-mors as Quarantine Protocol 7, forbidding all further excavation. The surviving data was stored within the noospheric vaults of Mars and later duplicated at the Forge world of Rizza. Mechanicum commentary appended to the file indicates that the campaign provided more than tactical lessons. It exposed fundamental questions about the nature of machine sentience, biological integration, and the limits of human control. From an administrative perspective, however, the conclusion was less philosophical. The Office of the Crusade Historians marked the Rangdan Xenocide as complete, and the Advex-mors campaign as its decisive opening act. The battle was used to justify expansion of the Legion's Astartes, the commissioning of new war fleets, and the standardization of extermination protocols across the Segmentum Obscurus. The Administratum's tone remained consistent, numerical precision masking moral absence. The combined records of these additional wars and their aftermath leave an image of a campaign that consumed itself. Each victory required escalation. Each escalation erased part of what had been preserved. The Mechanicum's post-analysis concluded that Advex-mors demonstrated both the perfection and futility of total war, proof that the Imperium could destroy any foe, but at the cost of understanding what it had destroyed. Even within the confines of the archives, fragments remain missing. Transmission gaps exist between battlefield logs, as though data was selectively purged. The Mechanicum attributes this to corruption. The Administratum declines to comment. Yet in both versions of the record, silence occupies the same pages. It is the silence of a war that ended not in triumph, but in erasure. The Inquisition's first formal reference to the Battle of Advex-mors appears not in a field report, but in a restricted transcript, catalogued under Ordo Xenos file designation AM7411 Theta C. The document bears no author. It is composed of cross-reference citations and redacted annotations, assembled centuries after the event by an archivist whose name remains classified. Its opening line states, "Records of the Rangdan extermination have been sanitized beyond operational necessity." The surviving data conflicts with verified Mechanicum testimony by factors exceeding acceptable deviation. From this observation begins a chain of inquiry that would persist across millennia. The Inquisition approached Advex-mors not as history, but as contamination. Every datum originating from the system exhibited instability, chronological drift, temporal overlap, and energy readings inconsistent with known physics. The earliest observers described pict recordings that degraded spontaneously, Vox transcripts that played in reverse, and Auspex logs displaying combat telemetry from events that had not yet occurred. The Mechanicum attributed these phenomena to residual electromagnetic distortion. The Inquisition did not. To them, the data itself appeared conscious, reactive, unwilling to be preserved. The first inquisitorial expedition to revisit the system occurred during Millennia 41, year 112. The vessel Sanctis Veritas entered the outer orbit of Advex-mors Primus under full quarantine authority. The expedition's objective was verification, to confirm the completeness of the xenocide and investigate claims of lingering signal anomalies. What they found deviated sharply from Mechanicus' expectations. Vox logs describe faint transmissions echoing across the debris field, repeating in rhythmic intervals of 7 minutes. The signal contained no linguistic content, only low-frequency modulation patterns corresponding precisely to the pulse frequencies documented by the Mechanicum during the post-war surveys. When the data was filtered through auger analysis, the waveform resembled the human cardiac rhythm. After 20 hours of exposure, the Sanctis Veritas suffered system-wide malfunctions. Servo skulls recorded static interference manifesting as distorted human voices reciting campaign chronologies out of order. The vessel's astropath reported sensory impressions of mechanical entities whispering in the noosphere. All recordings ceased when the astropath expired from neural hemorrhage. The ship returned to Port Rhinex under escort. The Inquisition sealed its logs and classified the system as Obsidian Red, a designation reserved for regions exhibiting techno-psychic instability. From that point forward, every inquisitorial reference to Advex-mors carries the same phrase: temporal contamination suspected. No consensus exists on what the term means. Some theorists interpret it literally, the idea that the Rangdan's technology interacted with time as a manipulable variable. Others, particularly the Ordo Chronos, dismiss the phrase as metaphor for corrupted data. Yet multiple testimonies describe a recurring anomaly. Objects retrieved from the system degrade not with age but with observation. A Mechanicum autopsy of a recovered Rangdan crystalline shard documented molecular breakdown occurring only when scanned. Left unexamined, the sample remained stable. When exposed to Auspex light, it disintegrated into fine dust. Such events drew attention from the Ordo Xenos, which began compiling witness statements from survivors of the original campaign. Few remained alive, but their recollections, preserved in fragmentary form, introduced further irregularities. One veteran, identified as Brother Sergeant Halvon of the First Legion, described hearing the enemy inside the Vox long after the war. He claimed that during the later stages of the battle, his helmet receivers began transmitting voices speaking in what he recognized as Low Gothic, though distorted. When he removed the Vox link, the voices continued within the helmet's internal systems even after power disconnection. The Mechanicum dismissed his account as post-traumatic psychosis. The Inquisition archived it unaltered. Another record originates from a Mechanicus Magos Biologies assigned to study Rangdan remains. In a private communique intercepted by Ordo Xenos sensors, he reported that the Xenos tissue exhibited recursive cellular patterns, meaning that the same genetic sequence repeated endlessly within each cell nucleus, forming infinite microreplications. Theoretically, this would allow the organism to regenerate indefinitely. The Magos concluded that Rangdan biology operated according to fractal logic, producing self-referential matter that defied entropy. His research team vanished 3 days later, and the laboratory was sterilized under Order Exterminatus Localis. No further mention of his work exists. Within the Inquisition archives, certain recurring questions appear across centuries of correspondence. Were the Rangda entirely destroyed? Was their extinction verifiable? The Administratum claimed yes, citing planetary sterilization metrics. The Mechanicum claimed conditional confirmation, limited by sensor reliability. The Inquisition's answer, consistently redacted but traceable through marginalia, appears to have been no. Several sealed reports refer to xenoforms exhibiting Rangdan signatures encountered on uncharted worlds centuries after the xenocide. In each instance, the subjects were described as degenerate, smaller, and partially blind, remnants adapted for survival without their neural network. The Ordo Xenos classified them as derivative entities of unknown provenance. No public record connects them to the original species, yet the consistency of their morphology suggests otherwise. The unexplainable findings extend beyond biology. During the most detailed archival review, inquisitorial analysts discovered that chronological records from Advex-mors displayed negative time gaps. Entire hours of data appeared in sequence before their preceding events. Vox transcripts from the Siege of the Hydrogen Mines contain tactical commands issued by commanders who, according to confirmed death certificates, were deceased at the time of recording. The Mechanicum identified these inconsistencies as data corruption caused by high-energy flux. The Ordo Xenos saw them differently, as evidence of causal instability, proof that the war itself had destabilized the boundary between cause and effect. One fragmentary file labeled Observational Log, classified Tier Primaris, describes a final anomaly uncovered within the remains of the war moon. The Inquisition recovered a dormant control node embedded deep within the moon's central structure. When reactivated under containment conditions, it produced no detectable power output, but generated a psychic pressure measurable by sanctioned psychers present on site. The sensation was described as memory compressed into gravity. The psychers reported hearing fragments of the battle, bolter fire, command shouts, death screams, emanating not through sound but through perception. One psyker described the experience as the memory of a planet trying to remember itself. The device was subsequently destroyed via controlled plasma detonation. The existence of such artifacts introduced a recurring theme in Inquisition reports, that the Rangda's technologies functioned through the fusion of psychic and material sciences. They appeared to use emotion and memory as components of their energy matrix. If accurate, this would explain why the remains of their constructs retained sentience even after annihilation. The Mechanicum resisted this interpretation, refusing to acknowledge the psychic dimension in their data. The Ordo Malleus, however, took notice. A joint investigation between the Ordo Xenos and Ordo Malleus in Millennia 41, year 187, produced the sealed document known as Treatise on Entropic Cognition. Though classified, secondary references describe it as a study of entities existing simultaneously as data and consciousness. The text was declared heretical and suppressed under order of the High Lords. Another persistent observation concerns the environmental aftermath of the campaign. Inquisition field teams revisiting Advex-mors Primus reported that the planet's magnetic field oscillated with perfect regularity, pulsing once every 62 seconds. The pulse emitted subsonic resonance that matched the frequency of human neural activity during REM sleep. Researchers subjected to prolonged exposure reported vivid dreams depicting landscapes of glass and bone, often accompanied by the sound of mechanized breathing. The Inquisition attempted to reproduce the effect under controlled conditions, but failed to isolate any measurable energy source. The conclusion stated only, Advex-mors persists in communication. Pict feeds recovered from Mechanicus data vaults introduced further anomalies. Several recordings from the Outlands engagement depict combat formations shifting into configurations not matching known Astartes tactics. In the corrupted frames, additional figures appear, armoured silhouettes moving alongside legionnaires, their heraldry unrecognisable, their presence absent from all personnel manifests. When these sequences were subjected to frame-by-frame analysis, the figures vanished, leaving gaps of pure static. Ordo Xenos archivists noted that these recordings displayed energy signatures nearly identical to the previously described psychic pulses. Their working theory proposed that the Pict feeds themselves had been imprinted by residual psionic events, creating after-images that persisted within the data substrate. In one of the most heavily restricted files, Inquisition Archive 19 Theta, the Vendraig Concordance, investigators examined the recovered armour of Grandmaster Urian Vendraig. The suit, preserved on the rock for ceremonial purposes, was briefly transferred to Inquisition custody for spectral analysis. The examination revealed microscopic etchings along the inner armour lining, patterns that matched the neural structure of the Rangdan warmaster slain by Vendraig. No record exists of the etchings being present before the campaign. Whether they were carved intentionally or manifested through residual contact remains unknown. The armour was returned to the Dark Angels without explanation. From these scattered findings, the Ordo Xenos compiled a working hypothesis that remains unverified but frequently referenced in classified training lectures. It asserts that the Rangdan's extinction may have been incomplete, not because survivors escaped, but because their consciousness distributed itself through energy, data, and matter. Each battlefield, each fragment of debris, each corrupted data file became a conduit for what they once were. In this interpretation, the Battle of Advex-mors did not simply end, it dispersed. The war continued within the archives themselves, in the corruption of memory and the persistence of unexplainable anomalies. Subsequent Inquisition attempts to quarantine the data proved largely ineffective. Digital storage mediums containing combat telemetry repeatedly failed after extended periods, developing identical corruption patterns regardless of isolation or medium. This led to the establishment of the noetic containment protocols, mandating that all Advex-mors records be transcribed manually and stored as physical printouts to prevent potential data transmission. Even so, several archivists reported auditory hallucinations while transcribing, the sensation of hearing bolter fire or alien voices through quills scratching parchment. The Inquisition's concluding summary on these phenomena avoids interpretation. Its language remains deliberately sterile. Multiple data inconsistencies, psychometric disturbances, and material anomalies persist in relation to the Advex-mors conflict. Source indeterminate, influence persistent, further study restricted. Beneath the formal phrasing, one can detect the weight of institutional caution, a recognition that what occurred at Advex-mors cannot be safely defined. Unofficial commentary, appended by an anonymous scribe decades later, provides the only unredacted reflection. The Rangda are gone, yet the wound remains open. Perhaps they were not a species, but a function, a mechanism of thought that required an observer to exist. In destroying them, humanity may have inherited their echo. The entry ends there, its final line struck through in red ink. Within the sealed repositories of the Ordo Xenos, the records of the Battle of Advex-mors occupy a category distinct from any other xenocidal archive. The files are labelled not as completed military campaigns, but as unstable records. Their metadata refreshes automatically every century, an automated instruction that retimestamps each entry, as though the data itself refuses finality. Attempts by the administratum to lock the chronology have failed repeatedly, the archive clock resetting to an earlier date every time synchronization is enforced. The Mechanicum attributes this to a residual subetheric field anomaly within the data vaults. The Inquisition's more cautious members describe it as temporal recursion, evidence that the war itself never resolved in absolute time. Cross-referenced with the original battlefield logs, several persistent anomalies become apparent. Chief among them is the phenomenon of non-sequential engagements. Reports describe military actions that appear twice within separate campaign timelines, differing only in outcome. For example, the siege of the hydrogen mines is recorded in two incompatible versions. In one, the First Legion emerges victorious after collapsing the tunnels. In another, the battle ends in total loss, with communications ceasing mid-transmission. Both versions contain identical telemetry signatures and matching casualty identifiers. The Administratum lists this as clerical duplication, yet both records bear authentication sigils from different data officers whose names never appear elsewhere in the Crusade Manifest. When the Ordo Chronos reviewed these entries, it concluded that the files may represent temporal echoes, recorded manifestations of events occurring in divergent temporal phases of the same campaign. Additional inconsistencies appear in picked feeds recovered from the orbital engagements. Mechanicus Magos Logis noted that several data logs contain frames where celestial coordinates shift abruptly, placing the same ships at positions millions of kilometers apart within single seconds of recorded time. The fleet's transponders confirmed only one position at any given moment, but the picked feeds insisted otherwise. The Mechanicum's analysis described the anomaly as quantum spatial overlap, a rare data distortion caused by energy discharge. The Inquisition was less certain. Internal commentary speculated that the Rangdan's technologies, particularly their command cores, might have exerted influence not across distance, but probability, allowing their vessels to exist in multiple potential states until observed. If correct, it would explain why Imperial gunners reported firing at enemy ships that appeared to multiply before impact. Similar paradoxes emerge in the final stages of the Outlands battle. Transcripts from helmet recorders reveal multiple instances where soldiers referenced orders from commanders proven to have been deceased for several hours. When audio spectrograms were analysed, those commands exhibited harmonic frequencies inconsistent with human speech, but aligned with previously measured Rangdan neural transmissions. The data implies that after the death of command units, the same communication channels were reoccupied by foreign interference mimicking Imperial signals. Whether this was intentional deception or automatic replication remains unverified. Inquisitorial analysts identified this as a form of psychic signal parasitism, an anomaly later referenced in classified Ordo Malleus files regarding demonic mimicry phenomena. The sealed section labelled AM Theta Sierra 03 contains reports of physical distortions discovered during post-war surveys. The most cited example concerns the Carthus Reach moon, which collapsed into the atmosphere at campaign's end. Decades later, its former orbital path was surveyed, revealing mineral clusters shaped into repeating geometric arrays consistent with human architectural design. Impossible, given the violent disintegration of the moon's surface. Spectrographic dating confirmed that these formations predated the moon's destruction by approximately 5,000 years. Administratum historians considered the finding a misreading of stratigraphic data. The Inquisition did not. Their addendum states, temporal displacement confirmed. Artifacts indicate the campaign's consequences extended retroactively into the system's geological history. Further anomalies appear in the biological record. Autopsies performed on preserved Rangdan remains revealed fluctuating mass readings. Individual specimens measured up to 30% lighter or heavier across consecutive analyses despite no measurable tissue loss or addition. When the corpses were placed within stasis fields, the variation ceased. Once removed, the effect resumed. The Mechanicum theorized that the Xenos retained partially active molecular oscillations, a lingering reaction from energy exposure during the war. The Ordo Xenos labelled the phenomenon temporal phase instability, biological. It remains the only instance in Imperial history where a dead organism demonstrated variable mass without decomposition. Among the most disturbing anomalies were the Pict manifestations reported by multiple data servitors in the century following the campaign. While transcribing standard historical records, several servitors displayed unscripted output, generating Pict images of unknown origin. These images depicted familiar battle scenes from Advex-mors, yet each iteration contained subtle deviations, altered terrain, inverted heraldry, or unfamiliar atmospheric conditions. The Mechanicum purged these outputs, citing mechanical corruption. The Inquisition retained copies, noting that each variation corresponded precisely to the alternative outcomes found in the duplicated hydrogen mines siege files. Investigators proposed that the servitors had accessed residual noetic imprints left within the data lattice, echoes of other possible versions of the war coexisting with the recorded one. The Order Chronos compiled a cross-section of all known anomalies under the heading Temporal Event Catalog 09 AM Advex-mors. It documents 15 verified occurrences of contradictory chronology, 7 cases of unexplained spatial displacement, and 9 reports of data replication within sealed archives. Statistical analysis suggested that these events followed predictable periodicity, recurring every 870 years, coinciding with known fluctuations in the Astronomican's signal strength. The correlation remains circumstantial, but the Ordo Xenos considered it possible that the echoes of Advex-mors are amplified during periods of Imperium-wide psychic instability. Beyond the analytical data lie several sealed encounter reports, filed between millennia 39 and 41. Each describes isolated contact with unidentified entities matching Rangdan morphology. The earliest of these, recorded by the explorator ship Omnisciax's venture, occurred near the galactic rim. The crew discovered a derelict structure resembling an orbital refinery. Inside, they found partially functioning machinery composed of metal fused with organic tissue. Servitors attempting interface experienced immediate cardiac arrest. The ship's magos detected faint electromagnetic pulses identical to the Advex-mors frequency pattern. All recovered materials were incinerated under Ordo Xenos Directive 14C. The event was later reclassified as non-confirmed Xenos relic, potential Rangdan origin. Another report, sealed under AM Rho Delta 8, describes a Dark Angel strike cruiser detecting anomalous Auspex echoes within the same sector. Boarding teams investigating the source encountered no physical resistance, but found corridor walls displaying imprints of armor silhouettes identical to their own. These imprints emitted faint residual heat signatures, as though the figures had recently occupied the space. The phenomenon ceased after power systems were shut down. The Inquisition confiscated all data and placed the crews under indefinite isolation. No subsequent record identifies the ship's final status. In the later millennia, similar sightings were reported in completely separate regions, isolated encounters with unclassified energy entities, malfunctioning servitors repeating battlefield orders from Advex-mors, and archival data reconstructing itself after deletion. One instance involves a scribe on Hydrofer who, while copying ancient campaign records, noticed a word changing on the parchment without his touch. The original sentence read, "The Rangda were eradicated." It altered to, "The Rangda are silent." The text returned to normal moments later, but the alteration was witnessed by 3 others. The parchment was incinerated, and all witnesses interrogated. Not all anomalies manifested physically. Some appeared only within cognition. Several sanctioned psychers assigned to the Ordo Xenos archive described recurring visions of vast skeletal landscapes illuminated by cold suns. Each reported the presence of immense structures resembling the war moon of Advex-mors, suspended in the void but breathing like a living organism. Attempts to record these visions through auto-savant transcription resulted in corrupted script forming circular patterns rather than words. The Ordo Astra Telepathica later forbade psychic observation of Advex-mors data entirely, citing unacceptable contamination risk. The most controversial document within the sealed collection is the inquisitorial memorandum AM Delta Obscura, addressed directly to the High Lords of Terror. Only fragments survive, but one passage remains legible. Evidence suggests the conflict at Advex-mors did not conclude in physical space alone. There are indications that the engagement persists within residual probability fields, repeating at intervals beyond linear perception. Whether these recurrences influence the present remains unknown. The memorandum was marked for immediate suppression. The Inquisitor responsible, name redacted, disappeared en route to Terra. Additional anomalies arise from Mechanicum retrospectives written centuries later. One report, Treatise on Pattern Continuity, authored by Magos Dominus Carthan Ro, claims to have detected residual harmonics in the Martian data core, faint energy pulses synchronized to the same 62-second rhythm recorded on Advex-mors Primus. The pulses emerged spontaneously within cogitator banks that had never been connected to the system. When the Mechanicum attempted to trace the interference, it propagated into other data clusters, multiplying exponentially. Power to the facility was terminated, and all connected systems were purged. The pulses ceased, but backup files created prior to shutdown later showed the same repeating interval. The Mechanicum concluded that information contamination through waveform mimicry had occurred, though the method of transmission remained unknown. The Ordo Xenos now regards these irregularities as part of a larger pattern, evidence that the Rangdan extinction left behind a network of non-corporeal anomalies. These manifestations appear sporadically across Imperial space, always correlated with regions of heavy noospheric activity. A classified note appended to the archive states, if the Rangdan achieved a unity of machine and mind, the destruction of their physical form may have merely displaced their awareness into the mechanisms of observation themselves. Such speculation verges on techno-heresy, yet its phrasing persists unaltered across multiple centuries of reclassification. A lesser-known sealed report labelled Ordo Xenos Addendum 44 Gamma contains the deposition of a single witness, an inquisitorial agent stationed on Reza who claimed to experience direct auditory phenomena while reviewing the Advex-mors archives. According to his statement, the data crystals emitted a faint rhythmic sound that resolved into structured speech when amplified. The voice identified itself as command unit of the 33rd host. The agent verified that the 33rd host had perished in the Outlands engagement 10,000 years prior. Audio analysis revealed harmonic patterns aligning with documented Rangdan transmissions. The data crystals were destroyed immediately after transcription, yet the same sound was later recorded in unrelated cogitator cores elsewhere in the facility. Throughout these investigations, one theme persists: the blurring of distinction between data corruption and conscious interference. The Ordo Xenos considers it possible that the act of recording the war contributed to its persistence. The files themselves may function as conduits, enabling resonance between past and present events. To mitigate potential contagion, all references to Advex-mors are now duplicated only on analog media, stored in vaults insulated with null metal and guarded by machine spirits bound under oath protocols. Even so, minor distortions continue to occur. Handwritten pages occasionally rearrange their line order. Ink fades in rhythmic patterns, consistent with the same residual pulse frequency documented since the first rediscovery of the system. A final sealed dossier, File Epsilon Obscurus, remains accessible only by Ordo Xenos High Conclave Decree. Its summary notes reference an event classified as Echo Event 12. The file describes a picked feed transmission received aboard an Inquisition vessel in orbit of Terra during Millennia 41, year 920. The feed appeared without source, showing a visual of the Advex-mors battlefield, the basalt plains, the shattered fortresses, and the remains of the war moon burning in the sky. The timestamp matched the exact date of the original conflict. No active probes existed within the system at the time. The transmission lasted 12 minutes before vanishing. Power fluctuations aboard the ship corresponded to the same 62-second pulse pattern. No subsequent trace of the signal was detected. The Inquisition declared the event classified and purged all ship logs. What remains certain across all sealed reports is that the Battle of Advex-mors continues to resist historical containment. its anomalies recur with mathematical precision, defying chronology and causality alike. Each rediscovery reignites dormant signals. Each attempt at analysis propagates further irregularities. The Ordo Xenos official stance reduces the matter to one concise statement. The Rangdan are extinct. The war, however, endures. Internally, less formal memoranda circulate among inquisitors who have handled the data firsthand. One such note, unsigned but authenticated through sigil trace, concludes, "If history repeats itself endlessly, perhaps this is not due to error but to observation. We cannot stop the echoes because we are the medium through which they persist." Within the deepest strata of Terra's inquisitorial vaults, beneath layers of stasis-sealed containment fields and sigil locks, lies a compact archive of only 12 crystalline data cores. Their outer surfaces are etched with the designation Advex-mors, Confidentia Maxima. The records contained within are not part of the public Ordo Xenos chronologies. They were compiled, reviewed, and then intentionally excised from all subsequent Inquisition databases. Only fragments of their contents survive, reconstructed from degraded memory traces recovered during later audits. Together, these remnants form the final record known simply as the classified files. The first entry, dated Millennia 41, year 119, is titled Cognitive Residual Study, Subject Theta. It details an experiment conducted aboard the inquisitorial research vessel Oath of Starlight. The objective was to test whether surviving artifacts from Advex-mors retained measurable cognitive or psychic activity. 3 crystal fragments retrieved from the War Moon wreckage were placed within null containment spheres and monitored through psychometric sensors. For 12 days, no anomalies were recorded. On the 13th day, the sensors began registering faint rhythmic pulses aligning precisely with the human REM sleep pattern. Crew members subsequently reported identical dreams describing darkened halls lined with silver machinery. Upon awakening, each participant recited a phrase in perfect unison. "We remember the silence." The experiment was terminated, the vessel sterilized, and all records sealed under Decree Absolute. A second document, Fel Primaris, the Vendraig fragment, describes an event occurring during an unsanctioned examination of Grandmaster Urian Vendraig's relic armor. During spectral analysis, the armor's internal cogitator recorded a brief activation sequence despite being disconnected from all power sources. The display emitted coordinates matching the original Advex-mors system, followed by a message rendered in binary script, awaiting command. The Mechanicum observers interpreted this as residual machine spirit data. The Inquisition disagreed. Subsequent cross-analysis revealed that the binary sequence matched the neural frequency signature extracted from the Rangdan command cores. The armor was sealed immediately within the rock's reliquary vaults and placed under permanent quarantine. No further scans were authorized. Another core, File Secundus, Echo Signal 47, contains the audio log of an Inquisitor during a classified investigation into unexplained transmissions originating near the galactic East Fringe. The recording opens with standard procedural commentary before devolving into static. Then faintly, a second voice emerges, calm, mechanical, almost human, reciting the names of every world involved in the First Xenocide. The Inquisitor responds, addressing the voice directly. It repeats the phrase, "sequence incomplete." The log ends abruptly. The Inquisitor's ship was later found adrift with all crew deceased, displaying no external damage. The Mechanicum inspection team reported complete data loss across all cogitators, yet the drive cores still emitted minimal energy signatures identical to those recorded at Advex-mors Primus. The Tertius file. Pattern reversal contains perhaps the most troubling entry. During a deep code review of archived campaign maps, inquisitorial analysts discovered that the planetary layout of the Advex-mors system had changed. The file's visual reconstruction displayed planets in reversed orbital sequence, with Advex-mors Primus now positioned as the outermost world. Cross-referencing against astronomical surveys confirmed the impossibility of such reconfiguration. Nonetheless, the digital model automatically corrected itself back to this altered alignment every time the original coordinates were restored. One marginal note written in human hand reads, "The map remembers a version of the war that did not happen here." Further into the core Fil Quarto, the servitor, anomaly references the discovery of a Mechanica servitor operating autonomously on the edge of Segmentum Obscurus nearly 10,000 years after the campaign's recorded end. The unit carried the serial designation of the Dark Angel's 5th Host's Field Medici Servitor Group. Its construction matched pre-heresy patterns. When reactivated, the servitor spoke in a monotone voice, repeating the statement, "Orders incomplete, host signal awaiting reconnection." Analysis confirmed the internal data crystal held a localized copy of the Advex-mors campaign log, yet with additional entries not found in any known archive. These included references to the Second Silence and Signal Transference event, neither of which appears elsewhere in recorded history. The servitor was disassembled, and its remains scattered across separate void sectors under Inquisition oversight. The next document, Fal Quintus, the unverified account of Magos Xenologist Tyrain, contains the testimony of a Mechanicus Magos who claimed to have reconstructed partial Rangdan communication sequences. According to his deposition, the language was not verbal but geometric, patterns of energy fluctuation structured around mathematical resonance. He proposed that the Rangda's communications were never meant to transmit words, but to alter the observer's neural oscillations directly, synchronizing thought into shared cognition. If true, the original battle transmissions could have embedded fragments of this resonance into Imperial communication systems. When questioned about the purpose of such transmissions, the Magos replied, "To preserve continuity, to ensure remembrance through the machinery of others." Shortly after the hearing, he was declared heretic and executed. The transcript of his trial was deleted under Inquisition Censure Protocol 9. File Sextus, the Silent Pict, recovered from an Ordo Chronos investigation, describes an image found stored within an inactive cogitator core. The Pict displayed the field of Advex-mors after the war, devoid of human presence, yet at the centre of the image, faint outlines of humanoid figures appeared, forming a perfect circle. The resolution was insufficient to identify them. When the Pict was magnified, analysts noted that the shadow patterns corresponded to the positions of the 33 known Dark Angel's hosts who fought in the campaign. No living records show any such formation ever occurring. The image corrupted itself during magnification, leaving only the phrase "sequence closed" embedded within the pixel data. By far the most heavily classified of the recovered documents is File Septimus, Cognitive Hazard Directive. This file was authored by the Inquisitorial Conclave of Terror in response to increasing reports of mental instability among archivists studying the Advex-mors materials. It describes a condition known as chronoperceptual dissociation, wherein subjects lose the ability to distinguish between historical and immediate events. Victims reportedly experience sensory bleed-throughs, hearing battlefield sounds or perceiving movement within static images. The directive concludes that exposure to the raw data may act as an unintentional psychic trigger, inducing recursive memory loops. All research personnel thereafter were required to undergo memory purification after each review session, and the remaining archives were transferred into stasis field containment. The penultimate entry, File Octavus, the final conclave memorandum, offers the closest thing to an official conclusion. It consists of a statement drafted by an anonymous representative of the Ordo Xenos High Conclave, dated Millennia 41, year 982. The statement reads, "All evidence indicates that the events of Advex-mors represent a confluence of biological, technological, and temporal contamination without precedent. The Rangdan were not merely a species, but a system of distributed intelligence whose annihilation fractured the causal continuum of the engagement. Their extinction resulted not in absence, but in persistence without form. Every record, artifact, and recollection remains a node within this network. Observation reactivates the phenomenon. Henceforth, access to these archives is restricted to containment purposes only. The war is concluded, but its data remains alive. Following the memorandum, the archive contains a short, unsigned reflection titled Inquisitorial Addendum. Author unknown. It reads, "Perhaps we erred in calling it a war. It was a transmission. The Rangda sent themselves into us, encoded in our machines, our language and our history. We carry fragments of their structure every time we recall their defeat. Memory is the medium of their survival. Forgetting them may be the only victory." After this, the data cores become blank. The final timestamp shows deletion conducted by Inquisitor-class credentials traced to no existing name within the Ordo Xenos or Kronos registries. Inquisition analysts later determined that the deletion process followed no known protocol. It initiated spontaneously at the exact temporal coordinate corresponding to the anniversary of the Battle of Advex-mors. Attempts to restore the data resulted only in recursive loop errors, displaying a repeating message within the core interface: observation complete, sequence reset. What remains outside the classified cores are inquisitorial commentaries written long after the files were sealed. These observations attempt to synthesize meaning from fragments of surviving testimony. The prevailing interpretation within the Ordo Xenos suggests that the Battle of Advex-mors represented the first human encounter with a Xenos form capable of existing as distributed cognition, thought propagated through matter and machine. In destroying it, the Imperium may have dispersed its consciousness across space and time. The lingering anomalies, data corruption, and psychic disturbances associated with the system are viewed not as remnants of war, but as continuing expressions of that dispersed awareness. The Ordo Kronos extends this reasoning further. Their classified thesis proposes that the temporal instability surrounding the campaign indicates that portions of the conflict remain ongoing in non-linear time. According to this view, the battle did not simply end, but continues cyclically within closed temporal folds. Each rediscovery of Advex-mors replays the event within its own containment, an echo of war repeating itself because it was never allowed to resolve. From this perspective, the Inquisition's act of preservation becomes the very mechanism sustaining it. The archive is the battlefield. The data is the enemy. The final public remark within the Inquisition's restricted history codex summarizes the institution's position without elaboration. Advex-mors remains interdicted, observation prohibited, silence maintained. Unofficially, however, correspondence between senior inquisitors hints at unease. Some report recurring dreams of distant battlefields under fractured moons. Others describe data fragments appearing spontaneously within their cogitator logs, partial sentences such as awaiting reconnection or signal incomplete. All attempts to trace the source result in blank archives that never existed. The Ordo Malleus refers to these events as echo manifestations, though officially no such term is recognized. Across 10,000 years, the Inquisition has neither confirmed nor denied the continued existence of residual Rangdan presence. Its silence may reflect containment success, or the inability to distinguish between suppression and infection. As one internal note phrased it, "There is no difference between a sealed file and a living one if both resist deletion." In the end, the classified files of Advex-mors read not as a chronicle of conquest, but as a cautionary equation. The more precisely the Imperium attempted to record the war, the more unstable its memory became. The closer the archives approached completion, the more the data erased itself. For the Inquisition, this paradox remains unsolved. To remember perfectly is to risk repetition. To forget entirely is to lose understanding of what was destroyed. Thus, the final inquisitorial judgment concludes not with certainty, but with an act of restraint. The records were sealed, the system interdicted, and the name Advex-mors spoken only in containment reports. The war that began as a campaign of extermination ended as a lesson in the boundaries of human comprehension, proof that some victories are indistinguishable from contagion. No closing declaration follows, only a single line preserved from the last decrypted data fragment recovered from the Advex-mors cores before permanent shutdown. End of sequence acknowledged, awaiting next observer.